Chapter 7. It was only at moments like these I had any time to reflect on my circumstances, or that giddy chance which had shot me into space in this fashion, and, frankly, the opportunities, when they did come, brought such an extraordinary depressing train of thought, I by no means invited them. Even with the time available, the occasion was always awry for such reflection. These dainty triflers made sulking as impossible among them as philosophy in a ballroom. When I stalked out like that from the library in fine mood to moralize and apostrophize heaven in a way that would no doubt have looked fine upon these pages, one sprightly damsel, just as the gloomy rhetoric was bursting from my lips, thrust a flower under my nose, whose scent brought on a violent attack of sneezing, her companions joining hands and dancing round me while they imitated my agony. Then, when I burst away from them and rushed down a narrow arcade of crumbling mansions, another stopped me mid-career, and taking the honey stick she was sucking from her lips, put it to mine, like a pretty, playful child. Another asked me to dance, another to drink pink oblivion with her, and so on. How could one lament amongst all this irritating cheerfulness? Anne might have helped me, for poor Anne was intelligent for a Martian, but she had disappeared, and the terrible vacuity of life in the planet was forced upon me when I realized that, possessing no cognomen, no fixed address or rating, it would be the merest chance if I ever came across her again. Looking for my friendly guide, and getting more and more at sea amongst the maze of comely but similar faces, I made chance acquaintance with another of her kind, who cheerfully drank my health at the government's expense, and, chatting on things Martian, she took me to see a funeral by way of amusement, and I found these people floated their dead off on flower-decked rafts instead of burying them, the send-offs all taking place upon a certain swift-flowing stream, which carried the dead away into the vast region of northern ice, but more exactly whither my informant seemed to have no idea. The voyager on this occasion was old, and this brought to my mind the curious fact that I had observed few children in the city, and no elders all, except perhaps Hath, being in a state of sleek youthfulness. My new friend explained the peculiarity by declaring Martians ripened with extraordinary rapidity, from infancy to the equivalent of about 25 years of age with us, and then remained at that period however long they might live. Only when they died did their accumulated seasons come upon them. The girl turning pale and wringing her pretty hands in sympathetic concern when I told her there was a land where decrepitude was not so happily postponed. The Martians, she said, arranged their calendar by varying colors of the season, and loved blue as an antidote to the generally red and rusty character of their soil. Discussing such things as these, we lightly squandered the day away, and I know of nothing more to note until the evening was to come again. That wonderful purple evening which creeps over the outer worlds at sunset, a seductive darkness, gemmed with 10,000 stars riding so low in the heaven they seemed scarcely more than mast high. When the hour was come, my friend tiptoed again to my cheek, and then, pointing to the palace, and laughingly hoping fate would send me a bride, as soft as a catkin and sweet as honey, slipped away into the darkness. Then I remembered all on a sudden that this was the connubial evening of my sprightly friends, the occasion when, as Anne had told me, the government constituted itself into a gigantic matrimonial agency, and, with the cheerful carelessness of the place, shuffled the matrimonial pack anew, and dealt a fresh hand to all the players. Now I had no wish to avail myself of the sailor's privilege of a bride in every port, but surely this game would be interesting enough to see, even if I were but a disinterested spectator. As a matter of fact, I was something more than that, and had been thinking a good deal of Heru during the day. I do not know whether I actually aspired to her hand. That was a large order, even if there had been no suspicion in my mind that she was already bespoke in some vague way by the invisible Hath, most abortive of princes. But she was undeniably a lovely girl. The more one thought of her, the more she grew upon the fancy, and then the preference she had shown myself was very gratifying. Yes, I would certainly see this quaint ceremonial, even if I took no leading part in it. The great centre hall of the palace was full of radiant light, bringing up its ruined columns and intruding creepers to the best effect when I entered. Dinner also was just being served, as they would say in another and alas very distant place, and the whole building thronged with folk. Down the centre low tables with room for 400 people were ranged, but they looked quaint enough since but 200 were sitting there, all brand new bachelors about to be turned into brand new Benedicts, and taking it mightily calmly it seemed. Across the hall top was a raised table similarly arranged and ornamented, and entering into the spirit of the thing, and little guessing how stern a reality was to come from the evening, I sat down in a vacant place nearer to the dais, and only a few paces from where the pale ghost-eyed Hath was already seated. Almost immediately afterwards, music began to buzz all about the hall, music of the kind people loved, which always seemed to me as though it were exuding from the tables and benches, so disembodied and difficult it was to locate. All the sleepy gallants raised their flower-encircled heads at the same time, seizing their wine cups, already filled to the brim, and the door at the bottom of the hall opening, the ladies, preceded by one carrying a mysterious vase covered with a glittering cloth, came in. Now, being somewhat thirsty, I had already drunk half the wine in my beaker, and whether it was that draught, drugged as all Martian wines are, or the sheer loveliness of the maids themselves, I cannot say. But as the procession entered, and, dividing, circled round under the colonnades of the hall, a sensation of extraordinary felicity came over me, an emotion of divine contentment purged of all grossness, and I stared at the circling loveliness, gossamer clad, flower girdled, tripping by me with vapid delight. Either the wine was budding in my head, or there was little to choose from amongst them, for had any of these ladies sat down in the vacant place beside me, I should have certainly accepted her as a gift from heaven, without question or cavil. But one after another they slipped by, modestly taking their places in the shadows, until at last came Princess Heru, and at the sight of her my soul was stirred. She came undulating over the white marble, the loveliness of her fairy person dimmed but scarcely hidden by a robe of softest lawn and the color like rose petals, her eyes aglitter with excitement, and a charming blush upon her face. She came straight up to me, and, resting a dainty hand upon my shoulder, whispered, "Are you come as a spectator only, dear Jones, Mr. Jones? Or do you join in our custom tonight?" "I came only as a bystander, lady, but the fascination of the opportunity is deadly. And have you any preference?" This in the softest little voice from somewhere in the nape of my neck. "Strangers sometimes say there are fair women in Seth." "None, till you came, and now, as it was said long time ago, all is dross that is not Helen." Dearest lady," I ran on, detaining her by the fingertips and gazing up into those shy, star-like eyes, "must I indeed put all the hopes of your kindness has roused in me these last few days to a shuffle in yonder urn, taking my chances with all these lazy fellows? In that land whereof I was, we would not have had it so. We loaded our dice in these matters. A strong man there might have a willing maid, though all heaven were set against him. But give me leave, sweet lady, and I will ruffle these fellows. Give me a glance, and I will barter my life for your billet when it is drawn. But to stand idly by and see you won by a cold chance, I cannot do it." That lady laughed a little, and said, "Men make laws, dear Jones, for women to keep. It is the rule. We must not break it." Then, gently tugging at her imprisoned fingers, and gathering up her skirts to go, she added, "But it might happen that wit here were better than sword." Then she hesitated, and freeing herself at last slipped from my side, yet before she was quite gone, half turned again, and whispered so low that no one but I could hear it, "A golden pool, and a silver fish, and a line no thicker than a hair." and before I could beg a meaning of her, had passed down the hall and taken a place with the other expectant damsels. A golden pool, I said to myself, a silver fish, and a line of hair. What could she mean? Yet that she meant something, and something clearly of importance, I could not doubt. A golden pool and a silver fish. I buried my chin on my chest and thought deeply, but without effect, while the preparations were made, and the fateful urn, each maid having slipped her name tablet within, was brought down to us, covered in a beautiful web of rose-colored tissue, and commenced its round, passing slowly from hand to hand, as each of these handsome, impassive, fawn-eyed gallants lifted a corner of the web in turn and helped themselves to fate. A golden pool, I muttered, and a silver fish. So absorbed in my thoughts, I had hardly noticed the great cup begin its journey, but when it had gone 3 or 4 places, the glitter of the lights upon it caught my eye. It was of pure gold, round-brimmed, and circled above with a string of the blue convolutions, which implies delight to those people. Aye, each man was plunging his hand into the dark, and taking his turn of a small notched edge mother-of-pearl billet from it that flashed soft and silvery as he turned it in his hand to read the name engraved in unknown characters thereon. Why, I said with a start, surely this might be the golden pool, and these the silver fish. But the hair-fine line? And again I meditated deeply, with all my senses on the watch. Slowly the urn crept round, and as each man took a ticket from it and passed it, smiling to the sensual behind him, that official read out the name upon it, and a blushing damsel slipped from the crowd above, crossing over to the side of the man with whom chance had thus lightly linked her for the brief Martian year, and putting her hands in his, they kissed before all the company, and sat down to their places at the table as calmly as country folk might choose partners at a village fair in hay-time. But not so with me. Each time a name was called, I started and stared at the drawer in a way which should have filled him with alarm had alarm been possible to these peace-soaked triflers, then turned to glance where, amongst the women, my tender little princess was leaning against a pillar with drooping head, slowly pulling a convolvulus bud to pieces. None drew, though all were thinking of her, as I could tell in my fingertips. Keener and keener grew the suspense as the name after name was told, and each slim white damsel skipped to the place allotted her. And all the time I kept muttering to myself about that golden pool, wondering and wondering until the urn had passed half round the tables and was only some 3 men up from me. And then an idea flashed upon my mind. I dipped my fingers in the scented water basin on the table, drying them carefully on a napkin, and waiting, outwardly as calm as any, yet inwardly wrung by these tremors which beset all male creation in such circumstances. And now at last it was my turn. The great urn, blazing golden through its rosy covering, was in front, and all eyes on me. I clapped a sunburnt hand upon its top as though I would take all the remaining in it to myself, and stared round at that company. Only her herself I durst not look at. Then, with a beating heart, I lifted a corner of the web, slipped my hand into the dark inside, muttering to myself as I did so, a golden pool, and a silver fish, and a line no thicker than a hair. And I touched in turn 20 perplexing tablets, and was no whit wiser, and felt about the sides, yet came to nothing, groping here and there with rising despair, until as my fingers, still damp and fine of touch, went round the sides a second time, yes, there was something in the hollow of the fluting, a thought, a thread, and yet enough. I took it unseen, lifting it with infinite forbearance, and the end was weighted, and the other tablets slipped and rattled as from their midst, hanging to that one fine virgin hair, up came a pearly billet. I doubted no longer, but snapped the thread, and showed the tablet, hearing Heru's name read from it amongst the soft applause of that luxurious company, with all the unconcern I could muster. There she was in a moment, lip to lip with me, before them all, her eyes more than ever like planets from her native skies, and only the quick heave of her bosom, slowly subsiding like a groundswell after a storm, remaining to tell that even Martian blood could sometimes beat quicker than usual. She sat down in her place by me in the simplest way, and soon everything was as merry as could be. The main meal came on now, and as far as I could see, those Martian gallants had extremely good appetites, though they drank at first but little, wisely remembering the strength of their wines. As for me, I ate fishes that never swam in earthly seas, and of strange fowl that never flapped away through thick terrestrial air, ate and drank as happy as a king, and falling each moment more and more in love with a wonderfully beautiful girl at my side, who was a real woman of flesh and blood, I knew, yet somehow so dainty, so pink and white, so unlike other girls in the smoothness of her outlines, in the subtle grace of each unthinking attitude, that again and again I looked at her over the rim of my tankard, half fearing she might dissolve into nothing, being the half fairy which she was. Presently she asked, "Did that deed of mine, the hare and the urn, offend you, stranger?" "Offend me, lady?" I laughed. "Why, it had been the blackest crime that ever came out of perverse imagination. It would have brought its own pardon with it. I, least of all in this room, have the least cause to be offended." "I risked much for you, and broke our rules." "Why, no doubt that was so, but 'tis the privilege of your kind to have some say in this little matter of giving and taking in marriage. I only marvel that your countrywomen submit so tamely to the quaintest game of chance I ever played at." "Ay, and it is a woman's nature, no doubt, to keep the laws which others make, as you have said yourself. Yet this rule, lady, is broken with more credit than kept, and if you have offended no one more than me, your penance is easily done." "But I have offended someone," she said, laying her hand on mine with gentle nervousness in its touch, "one who has the power to hurt, and enough energy to resent. Hath, up there at the cross table, have I offended deeply tonight, for he hoped to have me, and would have compelled any other man to barter me for the maid chance assigned to him. But of you, somehow, he is afraid. I have seen him staring at you, and changing color as though he knew something no one else knows." "Briefly, charming girl," I said, for the wine was beginning to sing in my head, and my eyes were blinking stupidly. "Briefly, hath thee not? And there's an end of it. I would spit a score of haths, and as these figs are spit on this golden skewer before, I would relinquish a hair of your head. I would relinquish a hair of your head to him, or to any man." And as everything about the great hall began to look gauzy and unreal through the gathering fumes of my confusion, I smiled on that gracious lady, and began to whisper, I know not what, to her, and whisper, and doze, and doze.